me invite you to open up your Bibles to Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5, and we'll begin there in just a few moments. We are continuing in a study of the book of Galatians that we began back in January. This will be our 11th lesson, and we'll conclude that series next month. If you're visiting with us and you'd like to go back, you can visit our YouTube page. The invitations for today have a QR code on the back that'll take you straight there, and you can listen to that whole series, bringing you through the text of Galatians. We are finishing up the 5th chapter and then going through a portion of the 6th chapter in our study this morning. And I hope to make some helpful connections in that text and hopeful, certainly some helpful applications for our lives. I've titled the lesson this morning, In Step with the Spirit, and that's the idea that we want to consider. How do we bring our lives into harmony with the Spirit? Marshall preached last time from a little bit earlier in chapter 5, looking at the fruits of the Spirit versus the works of the flesh and the contrast of those things. And we're going to revisit some of the territory that he covered because we're certainly building, all of this is building on arguments as you go along. And we want to see how what Paul says beginning here in chapter 5 and verse 25 builds on what he has already said. So let's begin there in chapter 5 and verses 25 and 26. He says, if we live by the Spirit, let us also walk in step with the Spirit. Let us not become those with vainglory, challenging one another, envying one another. As we think about that idea in verse 25, if we live by the Spirit, let us also walk in step with the Spirit. What I would want to say to begin with is that the Spirit is being contrasted with the flesh, not necessarily just in this verse, but in the context. As we go back to chapter 5 and verse 16, that Marshall covered last week, he says, I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. You see, that's the contrast. You're walking by the Spirit, you're not walking by the flesh. For, he says, the flesh sets its desire against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, for these are in opposition to one another, so that you do not do the things that you want. So when he says if we live by the Spirit, what does that mean? Well, a lot of commentators want to just immediately jump to living by the Spirit means that we're guided in some mystical way that's separate from the text. It's some indiscernible thing that the Spirit's just pulling us along. I think that's not at all the contrast that's being made. Are you living by the Spirit, not by the flesh? But in addition to that, what does that mean? What is it that is the flesh? Certainly, I think when we think of living by the flesh, we think of sexual immorality, we think of other forms of carnal sin, drugs and alcohol and promiscuity, filthy language, all of those sorts of things. And that's true. Those are fleshly behaviors. But I want to suggest to you that fleshliness and carnal mindedness can taint whatever we're involved with. If you go back to Romans chapter 7, and in verse 19, notice there, back in Galatians 5, we just read in verse 17, that the end of verse 17, we talks about this opposition of the Spirit and the flesh. He says, so that you do not do the things you want. In Romans 7, in verse 19, Paul says, for the good that I want, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want. So you see the similar language here between Galatians chapter 5 and Romans chapter 7? That in both cases he's saying that the thing that you want to do is not the thing that you're doing. And I want to suggest to you it is fleshliness that is causing that issue. Incidentally, I think that it is the fleshly usage of the law that is causing that. In Romans, there's so much overlap between flesh and law. Not that the law is fleshly. In fact, again, in Romans chapter 7 and in verse 14, Paul explicitly says we know that the law is spiritual. It, in and of itself, it's given by the Spirit. It's given by God. It's not the problem. But when we pick up the law with a fleshly mindset, what is the result? Discouragement, despair, death, all of those things that leave us condemned and do not bring us closer to God because we do not approach the spiritual mindset. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 9, Paul says, "But just as it is written, the things which eye has not seen and ear has not heard, and which have not entered into the heart of man, all that God has prepared for those who love him. But to us God revealed them through the Spirit, for the Spirit searches all things, even the depths of God." He says, "For among men, who knows the depths of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him? Even so, the depths of God no one knows except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world," and I would say that's the flesh, "but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may know the depths graciously given to us by God, of which depths we also speak, not in words taught by human wisdom, but in those taught by the Spirit, combining spiritual depths with spiritual words," or spiritual thoughts with spiritual words. "But a natural man," he says, "does not accept the depths of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually examined. But he who is spiritual examines all things, yet he himself is examined by no one." Throughout that text, there's these two different mindsets. And a fleshly mindset, I believe Paul is saying there will be cut off from God's truth. Will be cut off from the beauty and the glory and the life-giving nature of God's truth. And I think that as the Judaizing teachers were approaching the law, they are certainly approaching it with a fleshly mindset, right? So their mindset is that the law that the law actually is a divider, that it separates Jew and Gentile, as opposed to seeing its ultimate culmination in Christ, wherein it brings together Jew and Gentile. Circumcision is a thing that separates, as opposed to being a thing that makes someone committed and in covenant with God, and that is for all peoples, all children of Abraham through faith. I think in addition to that, just again, when they would go to the law, and I think the Judaizing teachers can be overlapped in many instances with Pharisaical teaching. When they would go to the law and think of it in fleshly terms, they would look at the law in shallow and truncated ways. We've talked about, in other instances, looking at the law of the Sabbath. I think the Pharisee approaches that, and what they see is the very shallow part of that instruction, the very minimal part of that instruction, which simply says, do not work. What does the Sabbath mean, you might ask to a Pharisee? And I think the fleshly Pharisee would say, the Sabbath means don't work. That is not what the Sabbath means. That is what the Sabbath instructs for a purpose to teach you something about the one who gave the law. And if you ignore what it says about the Spirit who revealed that, you will miss it entirely. I'll tell you what else you do. Because you only see that do not work, but you don't see that that's a life-giving command as opposed to an oppressive command. It's a life-giving command. And so what you do is you stack things on top of it. Well, we want to make sure we don't work. So you begin to stack things around that. Hedges, and said, not only are we not going to work, but let's see what sorts of rules we can put in place so that we do not even approach a violation of this command. And ultimately, in Jesus' day, what you see is people are being condemned not simply because they violated the command of the Sabbath, but because they violated all the hedges that are put around the Sabbath. Do you see how a fleshly usage of the law leads to condemnation and death? It leads to self-condemnation that is not from God, but is from man. Because you hold up and you say, all I see is this rule. But I don't see anything about the one who gave the rule. We ought to be reading. I appreciate so much what we're doing in our Bible class, what Marshall's taking us through, what we're doing at it as we're looking through the book of Genesis. We're not just saying, what do these words say? But we're saying, what is the Spirit saying? What's the point that he's trying to make? He's not simply telling us flat history. He is saying things about who he is and what he's accomplishing. You ought to be learning at the very least as we go through the book of Genesis and the Pentateuch as a whole, God is faithful and will keep his promises. If you don't learn that, then you are reading a dead book that leads to hopelessness and death. But if you are seeing a good God who has made wondrous promises to his people and will fulfill that, then that's going to help you see the beauty of that. I would even carry this over to more explicitly, maybe even plain commands about sexual immorality and so forth. If we see sexual immorality as merely God restricting us, as merely God saying, I think that's gross and I don't want you to do that, as opposed to God being a kind and loving God who's saying, I am trying to keep you from misery and despair, then I'm going to tell you, you do not have all that you need to keep you away from sexual immorality. If all you hear is, don't do that, that's a dead command. But if you hear, God is trying to help me, he loves me, and he is trying to keep me from destroying myself, then you are seeing the Spirit who gives that command. And you're not seeing someone who is simply a prude, somebody who simply wants to keep you away from fun and enjoyment. He's saying that's not what lies down that road. Now, that's how we live by the Spirit. We see his word as that gift, that life-giving thing, and we read it in that way, and we see the motivation and the goodness behind all of those commands. But as he says, if we do that, if we're really living by the Spirit, that's really where our life comes from, then we ought to keep in step with the Spirit. And can I suggest to you the only gauge to figure out whether we're doing that is what the Spirit has revealed in his word. I was reading one particular commentary, and he was using this passage as a that tell you how to be guided by the Spirit, how to walk in step with the Spirit, but it's rather open-ended. You know, it's not strict rules and regulations. It's just a guide by the Spirit, and we walk wherever the Spirit leads us. And so while we might like to have it all spelled out, the reality is none of it's spelled out, and we'll just have to have the Spirit guide us as we go along. It's cut off. I think the battery's got an issue, so we'll go with this right here. I'll try to stay right here then for the remainder. So as we look at that idea of the Spirit just kind of generically guiding us, or maybe not generically, but specifically guiding us, the reality is that so many people in the religious world say that is what they're doing, that they're all being guided by the Spirit, and yet they're all going different directions. And so the answer to the man who says that what Paul is suggesting here is that we need to have this, we need to just sort of surrender to the feelings, the flow of wherever the Spirit's taking us. The question is, when people are moving different directions, how do we decide who's actually being guided? Well, the Spirit has revealed in his word who he is and what he wants. What it is that is God's will. And so we open up his will, and that's what Paul is saying. Are you actually in step with what is described within his revelation? This goes back again to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, and in verse 13, where we read earlier that it is the combining of spiritual thoughts with spiritual words. It's not, I will say this, it is not as easy as sometimes people might want to make it, as opening up to a single passage and settling all arguments. Look, this verse says this, therefore, right? The Pharisee might do that. He says, look, it says don't work. Yeah, but did you read the rest of the passage? Did you read all of it? Did you read the context? Are you evaluating everything that the Spirit says about that and keeping that not only in harmony with the immediate context, but with the entirety of what the Spirit has revealed about that subject? So I'm not saying it's as simple. Sometimes we say book, chapter, and verse. I'm all about book, chapter, and verse. But a lot of times it's a lot of books, a lot of chapters, and a lot of verses that need to be brought into any given discussion. And we need to be careful that we don't look for those shortcuts. But the reality is, this is the only way to know. Like, there is no other test that we can put all the differing opinions and views and leadings by the Spirit to the test, but to open this up and say, how does that harmonize with this? So we do want to live by the Spirit, understand that the Spirit is what gives us life. But here is the means, here is the method by which it reveals that life to us, and by which we can say, I'm doing what the Spirit says. I'm walking in harmony with what the Spirit says. Well, I think as we continue on then into chapter 6, what we have is application of this idea of whether or not we are in harmony, whether or not we're in step. And here are some places where that comes into play, particularly among brethren. So he says, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 6, brothers, even if anyone is caught in any transgression, you are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each of you looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. He goes on, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But each one must examine his own work, and then he will have reason for boasting in regard to himself alone, and not in regard to one another, or to another. For each will bear his own load. Well, I want to start with that first phrase there, even if sin is involved. I think sometimes, like a lot of passages, we use this passage to show that we have a responsibility and instruction to restore erring brethren, people who are wandering off. I think that is true, and I think it's true from a number of different passages that we could point to. But I think the point here isn't that you need to make sure that you go restore brothers who are erring, but rather, as it starts there, even if anyone is caught in any transgression. As we fold that back onto what we've already been talking about, being led by the Spirit, walking in step with the Spirit, one of the issues at play throughout the book of Galatians is the division, the biting and devouring that is happening among these Christians because they're using the law in fleshly ways. And he's just told them about the attitude, the kind of gentleness and kindness and so forth, the fruit of the Spirit, that this should characterize their interactions as opposed to works of the flesh, which not only involve the things we think of as typically works of the flesh, but also these very fleshly attitudes, these divisive attitudes of hatred and anger and so forth. And so as he comes down here, I think the idea is, even if he's actually in sin, right? So I think what's happened is they've come down against brethren that are not actually in sin, right? They're just not circumcised. That's not sin. And even though they're not actually in sin, they've come down on them like a ton of bricks. How dare you? You're not as righteous and good and holy as we are because you're not circumcised. So they've come with fleshly attitudes, using the law in fleshly ways to condemn their brethren. And then now he says, look, even if they're in sin, you ought not have that attitude. Even if they're in sin, you ought to restore them with a spirit of gentleness. So I think the emphasis is not make sure you restore them, though that's important, but the emphasis is make sure even then that you restore them like this, with this spirit of gentleness. He goes on and says, each of you, of course, looking to yourself. So adding to that idea of gentleness here, he adds to it the idea of humility. And even, I think, a degree of sympathy. That idea of understanding what it is that someone is being tempted by. Understanding that you too fall into the range of temptation and the danger of temptation. He says in verse 3, for if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. So pride is being called out here. As we look over at Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 17, speaking of Christ, it says, therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in all things so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For since he himself was tempted in that which he has suffered, he is able to come help those who are tempted. I think one of the difficulties in trying to help people and trying to help restore people is that some people start from a place of thinking, I don't know why anybody would ever act like that. I don't understand why anybody would even be tempted by that. Well, if you can't imagine how somebody could possibly be tempted by that, then how are you going to try to understand and help bring them away from that? It says that Christ comes with sympathy. He has been tempted. Over in chapter 4 and verse 16, we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but is tempted at all points as we are. And so he can sympathize, and he can sympathize not because he has succumbed or given in to temptations, but because he knows what it's like to be tempted. Brethren, I think sometimes the reason we can't understand is because we don't even acknowledge where the temptations in our own lives are coming from. Even if we're not given into them. Like that's a difficulty. And we struggle to make the connection between my own temptations and that guy's temptations. We think, well, mine aren't anything like his. If anybody had that privilege and that right to say something like that, it's Christ. He has no connection to my sin and my depravity, except that he's able to see, I know what a pull looks like. And even though I overcame it, I understand. And I come to help. And so if we come in saying, I don't know why you are such an idiot, but I'll be here to help you. That ain't it. That's not going to help. And even if we can't come and say, I have fallen just like you've fallen, we could at least say, I understand what it's like to feel the tug of sin. And if you can't make that connection, then the problem's just not on their side. It's on your side too. And you're not going to be a very effective helper as is being described here. I think as it goes on in verse 4, each one must examine his own work, and then he will have reason for boasting in regard to himself alone and not in regard to another. For each one must bear his own load. I think the idea there is certainly not examine your own self so that you can end up being boastful, right? Maybe you look at that and you go, I'm going to look at myself and then I'll be able to walk around with chest poked out and look at me. Not it. I think the idea, it's almost a little bit of irony. Look at yourself and then you can talk about how great you are. The idea is if you look honestly at yourself, that should lead to humility. Right? That should make it so that you don't walk around boastful, so that you aren't arrogant about someone else's faults. That's the whole point of Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7 and beginning verse 1, do not judge so that you will not be judged, he says. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged, and with what measure you measure, it will be measured to you. And why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. I mean, we all know about the rampant abusage of this text that makes it so that you cannot even consider helping someone else because that would be judging. You can't point out sin, all of those things. I get all of that. But can I suggest to you that the idea here is the blind, arrogant person who can see all the minutest faults in everybody else and none of his own glaring ones. That's the idea. Don't be that person. The idea, too, as you remove the beam from your eye, we make this point. I understand. I appreciate the points being made. Remove, then you can see, so you still have that responsibility. But I think also the idea is after you've removed a beam from your own eye, if you have in fact done that, don't you think that would give you a little bit of humility when you come and see a speck in your brother's eye? I just got a beam out of my own eye. So I don't come going, hey, I fixed my problem. Now I get to take care of yours. It's the idea of, look, I know, there's my beam. I just set that down. I get it. Can I help you with what's in your eye as well? And so that brings a humility and an understanding, a self-awareness as we're trying to approach those who do need restoration. Again, I think the whole point is not make sure you go out there and prioritize fixing other people's lives. I think the idea is make sure you prioritize the attitude that comes from a spiritually led life. So that even when you must go and point out the error in somebody else's life, you do not come like these haughty people who are coming pointing out things that aren't even errors. Well, he goes on in verse 6, picking up, talking about participation with one another, sowing and reaping and persevering and doing good. Verse 6, he says, the one who is instructed in the word is to share in all good things with the one who instructs him. Verse 8 tells us, verse 7 says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. So we're talking about sowing and reaping, which, let me just say again, first of all, this is a universal rule with a specific application. So when you want to say that someone is living in some sort of sin, and you want to go to Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7 saying, look, whatever you sow, you will reap. That's fine. But Paul has a specific point in mind. And we want to make sure that we get the specific point as we're studying through this text. What is he talking about sowing? And what is he talking about reaping from that sowing? Well, I think as you look back to verse 6, to begin with, he starts talking about their relationship with those who have taught them the truth. This is a not infrequent point that Paul has to bring up. All through first and even more so in 2 Corinthians, Paul is having to deal with people who are distancing themselves from Paul while accepting various false teachers and hangers-on that are coming in contrary to what Paul is saying. And one of the things Paul says is, what happened here? Right? You know, why is there distance between us? And 2 Corinthians chapter 6 says, it's not on my part. You're the ones distancing yourself. And I think that's what's happening here. Here Paul has come through Galatia and he has taught them things. He's the one that has preached freedom, that has set them free, that has given them so many blessings. And now, what are you doing? Where are you investing? And so I think the idea here is that as we carry that out, is that we ought to be investing in our spiritual relationships. That it ought to be that we are putting time, effort, and even resources into cultivating and appreciating our spiritual relationships. And here are people who, for fleshly reasons, have cultivated other relationships. And just like the Corinthians, they are trying to develop those relationships at the expense and cost of the relationship to the Apostle Paul and to the truth that he taught. So we need to think about that for ourselves. There's so many people who don't invest in their spiritual relationships and then complain about what they reap when they have not sown. I don't have close friends among God's people. Why? Why is that? I don't feel close to anybody. Why don't you feel close to anybody? What are you doing? Are you sowing the sorts of things that will help you reap close relationships? Or are you generally focusing your attention elsewhere and then wondering why those things don't come in spite of the fact that you've planted no seeds? He says in verse 9 then, let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. I want to give some attention then at the close of this lesson to this, especially to those who are of the household of faith. Again, here is a passage that people go to show our universal responsibility to do good to everyone. But I want you to consider the context that Paul is speaking in. Is his context going all the way back through chapter 5 and really throughout the rest of the letter, is his concern how they treat everybody in the world, or is his concern about how they treat their brethren? And I would suggest to you, Paul's concern and his focus is how they treat their brothers. And so that this word especially is doing a lot of work here. It's an important aspect of this verse. I think that what Paul is saying is, yes, certainly, do good to everyone. But by all means, and most especially, you ought to be treating each other well and doing what's good within the kingdom and among your brothers. It might be like if you came to someone who had a reputation of being just this likable guy. He gets along with everybody loves him, and the workplace, when he gets together with his guy friends, he's just the life of the party, and at home, he is a tyrant. What might you say to that guy? You might say, listen, by all means, be personable. By all means, be friendly to all the people in the world. But in your home of all places, you ought to be the kind of person that they look up to and that they can appreciate and are thankful for, as opposed to there, of all places, you become rancorous and hateful. And I think that's exactly what the Galatians are guilty of. So that the issue is not Paul saying, make sure you do good to everybody. He's saying, make sure you do good here, of all places. That this is the part where the failure is. And isn't that a common malady? That the people closest to us are the ones that sometimes we struggle. We put on a show for everybody, but as one vicar said to C.S. Lewis one time, if a man can't be himself at home, where can he be himself? C.S. Lewis's response was, well, if that's who you are, then the answer is nowhere. You can't be that person anywhere. But most especially, you shouldn't be that person among the people who you have the greatest responsibility to show goodness and kindness to. So I don't think that here is some passage that as some folks want to come to and say, look, here's where the church should be good to everybody. Yes, the church, well, individuals within the church, and I think that's the issue. Incidentally, they're being considered individually in their interactions with each other. But it's not to universalize the church's responsibility. If anything, it's pointing the other direction. That the church's responsibility, the members of the church, have this primary and overriding responsibility towards each other. Well, the question then, as we come back to the beginning and the title of our lesson is, are we in step with the Spirit? As I said before, this is the only way to know. And it takes work, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes combining spiritual thoughts with spiritual words and putting those pieces together. But it also involves a consistent character. Like there's a picture, there's an image that if you're doing these things, this is what you will look like. And you will look like that not just in public places, but you will look like that among God's people. That this will result in gentleness and harmony and kindness among one another. And if that's not the case, then that is the particular concern. It's not the only concern ever, but that's the particular concern of Paul right here is it's obvious you're not in step with the Spirit. Like that's proof that you're not in step with the Spirit. So, on the one hand, it's not enough to say, I'm nice to everybody. On the other hand, it's also not enough to sit there and say, I've done the things. That is a fleshly way to look at the law. We must combine all of these things to know and to see I am living by the Spirit. And so if you're here this morning, maybe you've obeyed in some ways, but you are not allowing your life to be moved by what the Spirit has revealed. Maybe you see the disconnect, and maybe you realize maybe I am picking up the law in fleshly ways and using it in fleshly ways, but not embracing it as a connection and as a life-giving force that brings me into contact and into covenant with God. If you need to live by the Spirit, be guided by it, come into step with the Spirit, and if there's any way that we can help you this morning to do that, won't you come while we stand and while we sing.